We're standing here in front of the great triptych by Monet, known as the Agapanthus Triptych, which he started working on around 1915-16 and continued working on until his death in 1926. It's related to a whole series of these very large canvases where he just focuses entirely on the surface of the water in his water lily pond, the reflections of the sky in it, and these sort of floating rafts of water lily pads. Looking at this painting without knowing any background, you wouldn't think it was really anything to do with the First World War. It's certainly not a painting of war. In fact, it couldn't be further removed from war. It's about peace and nature, harmony. But actually, Monet was very affected by the First World War. The fighting wasn't so very far from Giverny, and on occasion he could actually hear the gunfire from his garden. Both his son and his stepson were fighting at the war, and many of the inhabitants of the village of Giverny, including some members of Monet's own family, fled. They thought it was too dangerous to stay there. But Monet refused to go, and he actually saw his painting in a way as a sort of patriotic effort, his contribution to the war. At one point, one of his sons came back on leave from the fighting, and Monet was terribly guilty. He had great pangs of conscience that, you know, not so far away, all these young men were suffering terribly and being killed and dying. And he said, "What am I doing? I'm just here in my garden and in my studio painting." But he said, "But this is what I do. This is my life's work, and I'm not going to walk away from it. I'm going to continue to do this." In 1918, the day after the armistice, through the auspices of Monet's close friend, Georges Clemenceau, who was the Prime Minister of France at the time, he donated 2 of the large panels to the French state. First of all, to celebrate the victory, but perhaps more importantly, as a gesture of peace and harmony, hoping to restore healing to a very fractured world. And gradually this idea developed, and eventually the idea for presenting a whole series of these large canvases evolved, and Monet donated them all to the French state. And they were installed in the Orangerie in Paris in 2 enormous oval rooms, so that he creates this environment where you're completely surrounded by the water lilies and the water and the sky. And they're permanently installed in the Orangerie in Paris, where they still are, of course. These 3 canvases, which we call the Agapanthus Triptych, were originally made in connection with that scheme. And ultimately, these 3 canvases were sold in the 1950s to 3 different American museums. The Cleveland Museum of Art, who are our partners in this exhibition, the St. Louis Art Museum, and the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. But they're all part of this concept that Monet had of creating these wonderful heroic works, in a way, as a response, as a reaction, his own personal, very personal reaction to the First World War. And this is the first time that the 3 panels have been brought together as a triptych, as Monet intended them to be, in Europe. So it's wonderful to have them here at the Royal Academy.